I was in the trauma. Like I was a victim of my story. We have our truth, my truth, your truth, but there really isn't the truth. This is the number one reason that my message is what it is, and that is owning your story. It was because I needed to own my own story.
So welcome to She is Mother. This is, I think, about maybe our 9th or 10th episode. This is a little bit of a different type of episode. We really want to be able to focus our energy over the next 90 days into building out this really rich framework or course or guide that you can follow along with yourself to be able to learn some of the techniques that have helped Dr. Arellano in her own life, as well as what she's used to help with all of her clients that she's seen, the people that she's touched in her life. Me personally, as her son, I've benefited from a lot of these techniques as well, too. We really want to get to the core of her work, which is talking about stories and what are stories? How do stories shape the way that we live our lives, the way that we experience the world? Where do stories come from? This episode is going to be the first of a brand new series called Own Your Story, which is going to be a 90-day journey led by Dr. Arellano, the team at She is Mother, many other people that are in her community, to really bring to light this idea of how you can rewrite your own story. I mean, I know for me personally, I often feel like I am a victim to my story, to the things that have happened to me, to the traumas, both little t traumas and big T traumas that have happened in my life. And when I'm in that place, I think it's really hard for me to feel like I have agency or ownership, or I can have the life that I've always wanted. And, I'm really lucky in that I'm Dr. Arellano's son. So I don't only call her Doctor. I don't always call her Dr. Arellano. I call her mom as well. But I think growing up with her and just seeing the way that she has changed her own life, the lives of so many of her clients, my own life. The way that she has shown that is something that we want to be able to bring to all of her community within this 90-day journey. So we're excited to get started with week 1. We're excited for you to follow along. Be sure to subscribe for a weekly update and follow along with our curriculum as we go forward on how to own your story. So that's enough of the introduction. So let's jump into it. I'm probably just going to call you Mom, I think, for the sake of this episode, but you can call her
I think
Dr.
that's fine.
Yeah. So Mom, I want to talk to you a little bit about this first lesson that you've created within this Own Your Story framework. I have read it through. It was really exciting to me to hear you just kind of put all your thoughts into this curriculum or this lesson that I could just take with me. You're not afraid to put all your own shit and trauma out there onto the page as well. So I want to talk a little bit about just what that experience was like for you, spotlighting your own life within this right now.
Sure. I think what's really interesting about this, Esteban, is when I think about the work that I do, and I think about how I think about all the clients that I've worked with, and my own unfolding of my own journey and my evolution. I think one of the things that really resonates for me is I'm not just a professional that has expertise. Like I am on this journey. Like I think about even our conversation today about stories. Like I didn't realize that I was telling myself stories probably until about, holy cow, maybe 15 years ago. I have a trauma history and there's nothing to be ashamed of. I've shared my trauma history. I mean, this is the whole premise of my book, Terrible Gifts, is I believe that sometimes we go through really hard things, and hard things, there's gifts in those. So how is that related to owning the story? It really is related. I think that when I recognized I was telling myself stories, it first came up in my relationship, in my intimate relationship. And I've been in my relationship. We're going to hit 25 years in December, which is a long time. And what I realized was when I look at my own evolution and I look at my own healing, In the beginning of it, I was in the trauma. Like I was a
Mm,
victim of my story. And the experience I had was, this is real. This is real. This is the truth. This is happening.
mm,
And what it took was, first of all, a lot of pain, a lot of tears, quite frankly, a lot of fighting. I've described in my this blog that, this next coming up blog, that I talk about my relationship being a roller coaster ride. And it felt like that. There was a lot of chaos, and I own the chaos, because I was bringing the chaos to the relationship, because what was happening was, there were things in the relationship that was triggering me or activating old scripts, but I didn't know that's what was happening. I thought the thing was real and true and happening right then and there. And over time, with lots of arguments and lots of tears and working through things, finally one day something clicked. And what clicked was, oh my God, what I'm telling myself that is actually happening and what my partner is saying are like miles apart.
I think it's interesting to hear you talk about this because, just being your son, I've also lived through a lot of this
You were the
experience that
witness, the observer.
I've been a witness and observer, and, I think most children are a witness to their parents' relationships, and so they have their own version of it too. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, like, what those stories look like for you in your relationship, and, like, if maybe there's, like, a situation or an example or, like, a specific, like, one example, like a story that you had with your partner that really brought that to light, that you were living in a story.
Absolutely, and I'm willing to be very transparent and very raw about the shit that came up for me in the relationship. I want listeners to understand that even me, I'm a professional. I'm an expert. I'm a couples coach. You would think I would know better. I'm not exempt. I mean, I still go through these challenges, and that's why I want to share it. And so, what happened was, what this is, I will say that despite the fact that my relationship has been one of the hardest things I've done in my life, I will say it's been the hardest thing that I've done in my life. I have a lot of gratitude for
Mm,
it, because it is, my relationship with my partner is the single most powerful thing that I've gone through, that has been the impetus for my healing.
hmm,
Again, there's that terrible gifts idea. It
hmm,
has been the strongest factor for my healing and my confronting my own trauma. And so the way that it came up in my relationship is, it started out like any other relationship, fireworks, madly in love, lots of chemistry. I thought this was going to be my dream, the white picket fence, insert person. I already had the baby. We'll put the person in after. And I had this wild idea of how wonderful things were going to be. And within 6 months of the relationship, we started having problems. And the problem really came from what was happening for me. And so, my partner has ADD. And so I think that's a really important thing to say, because what happens is my partner gets really caught up in moments. And that's a really common thing for somebody who has ADD. They lose perspective. They forget what's happening outside of the current lens, right? And also my partner traveled a lot. And so what would happen is my partner would go out of town and I wouldn't hear much from her. And my stories started. Now, I didn't know they were stories then. I
hmm,
thought they were the truth. And I would say things like, this was my inner dialogue. My inner dialogue was, out of sight, out of mind.
hmm,
She doesn't care about me. I don't matter to her. I'm not that important to her. If I were important, she'd be calling me or she'd be texting me. And, and it wasn't happening. And so the story doesn't end with that, because then what would happen is there was some form of acting out. I'm not going to lie, and what would I do? I would punish her. So some of it was punishment. Some of it was, I was shutting down. And if you look at trauma, you look at trauma responses, we've basically got four options. We either fight, we flight, we freeze, or we fawn. A lot of people don't know about fawning, and I can talk about that. So what I was doing was I was shutting down. I was running. So I wasn't literally running from the relationship. I was shutting down and cutting off. And so my partner experienced it as my disconnecting from her. And so she would get triggered and stirred
Mm.
up. And so you could see the chaos that would happen. And so the story would start. I would act as if the story were true. There would be action. The action or the decision would be, I don't trust you. I don't believe you. I'm not going to engage with you. I'm not going to trust you. I'm going to go into my own shell. I'm going to go into protective mode. And not going to lie, we probably did this dance for 12 years, 10, 15 years,
Mm.
until I started figuring it out, and part of it was that we went round and round and round on this merry-go-round. It was a pretty tumultuous merry-go-round, but finally it clicked. It clicked when she would say to me over and over and over and over again, I don't stop thinking about you. My love doesn't change for you when I'm out of town. I might be busy, but I'm always thinking of you. And what happened for me in those moments when it finally clicked, Esteban, it was like, oh my God, this is about abandonment. Well,
Mm.
crap. Look at my trauma. What was my number one trauma growing up was abandonment. Either whether it was emotional abandonment from my family, I shouldn't say my family, my caretakers, my mother, my father, my grandmother, whether it was emotional abandonment or actual physical abandonment. That was my original wound. That was my original trauma. And it wasn't until that light bulb went on, that I realized, oh, I'm telling myself something that isn't necessarily true. And so that is where this idea of stories came from.
Mm. It's so interesting to hear just like how like personal it is for you too. And like you, I'm sure have learned about all this in the classroom, when you were getting your degrees, like in all of your training and in, the therapy room where you've been a therapist for 30 years. But it seems like despite all this work you had done professionally, it wasn't really until you had been riding that, like, merry-go-round, as you said, for 15 years in this relationship when it, like, clicked maybe on this, like, deeper level for you.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And I want to bring it full circle as well, Esteban, because I also think that's what makes me a really good therapist,
Hmm.
or a good coach, is because I'm living it. I've lived it. I know what it feels like. I know what it feels like viscerally. I know what's happening in my head. I know what's happening in my body. So when a client comes to me with this, it's like, I know, I know.
Mm.
So it's not something I'm removed from. And so I can have a lot of empathy and I can have a lot of compassion because I understand it. I understand the tape in my head. I understand what happens in my body. I understand the reenactment of trauma and how sometimes, I know this is going to sound a little dramatic, but it really captures it well, is you almost feel like you're in a trance. Like you almost feel like somebody hits a play button and you just go through the script and it's like you're not even there. Like, you talked about agency. You don't have agency. It's like you're on autopilot. Like something is driving you instead of you being in the driver's seat. And I think what's driving you, for me anyway, was the trauma. It was the story that I made up. It was in charge. It was like I hit play and the script went off. The cameras were on, lights, film, action, all that. That's what was happening, and I was just an actor in it until I realized what I was actually doing.
Mm. It seems like that's a very, I mean, just that description, I feel like hits really home for me because I feel like I often feel like I'm in that similar like trance state almost, where it's like I feel like I have these really big emotions or feelings and
Mhm,
I don't really know what to do with them. I don't really know where they came from. I feel like part of me almost tries to invalidate them in some
mhm,
way. It's like, okay, I feel like I'm under attack right now. I feel like I'm in like a trauma, like I feel like I'm being traumatized, I guess, in some
mhm,
way, but that
mhm,
doesn't feel quite right. Like it's not like a capital T trauma, which,
mhm,
or like, something really adverse or harmful to me. I mean, like one thing I think that's coming up for me is just how similar maybe you and I like approach these kind of things. I think with that specific story too, it even comes up, I think, in my friendships and my relationship. Like I think about that a lot right now, especially in the past like couple weeks or months. I feel like that's just been happening a lot for me. I'm thinking about one friendship I have right now, where I feel like this person, we're really close, and I think both of us recently have just been super busy, and we've kind of been, you know, doing our own things, kind of going in different directions. And, I also have a partner. And so, I really love my partner, but part of the reality of being in a relationship is that that starts to take up more and more of your time. And, it's always like that option there. Like, oh, I don't necessarily need to be seeing friends. I could just go hang out with my partner or spend time with him. And so I think this friend and I started spending less and less time with each other. There's points where, like, we had made plans and I think those plans fell through for one reason or another. And I think the story I started to tell myself was very similar to the story that you're telling yourself, of that, I'm not valuable, or I'm not important, or, I think I started to get to a place where, um, I was thinking that is something that was like wrong with me, and or different about me. And I think I felt that for a lot of my life. I think now I'm in a place where I feel a lot more secure in who I am and like the person that I am. But that doesn't mean that the stories stop. I think for this specific instance, I was thinking a lot about, like, okay, this person, instead of spending time with me, is making a lot of time for, all of their white friends, or all their friends that are like really rich, or work in the same industry that they do. And they're doing things that I can't do or don't do. And I think for me, then that story starts going in my head, like, okay, this is the reason why. It's because of this. It's because I'm not those things. And I think while I'm not in a place anymore where I would think like, oh, I'm a failure because I'm not any of those things, my mind started to go to like, okay, well, fuck that friend. Like, that friend is so materialistic. That friend is so shallow. Like, obviously, don't be friends with them. Um,
Mhm.
and so,
Mhm.
yeah, and I think I had a very similar moment to you, whereas like, you know, I actually, like, recently had a conversation with that friend, and my friend's basically like, I am sensing something's off. I'm gonna, figure out what's going on. And I kind of said that, I didn't say the whole thing, but I was like, I feel like there's been a big gap between us right now. And I feel like in that gap, it's really easy for me to like fill in these stories. And I didn't go into like what the stories meant, because I think in my head, I was like, these stories probably are not real. I just read your blog post, so I was like, okay, I can start to put that framework into play for myself now. But I'll just say that I can see that coming up within myself too, and that's also happened in my relationship and in so many friendships that I've had over my life. So I think it's
Mhm.
interesting to hear how you and I are kind of going through similar experiences of that, like, kind of trance state of like acting from a place like living in that story rather than what's directly happening. Because when I
Mhm.
talked to that friend, they were basically like, that's not at all how I feel. Like, I'm just like very busy. Like, I know you're very busy too. And in fact, that friend had told me, like, I feel like with this space between us, I kind of was telling myself that you didn't like me, that I didn't like them. And so it was kind of funny. It ended up being funny. It's okay, like, that's not how I feel either. Like, let's just figure this out. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm sitting with. And it's interesting. Last thing I'll say is just, our lives have been so different. You've grew up in just like this very capital T trauma world in a way that I didn't. I think you did a lot of work to stop that cycle raising me, but I think it's interesting to hear how the way that we approach these kinds of stories are very similar to each other.
Right. And it makes you kind of wonder. It's like, okay, are the stories similar to one another because that's just common human experience, right? Or are they similar to one another because we're looking at intergenerational trauma? Or are they similar to one another because you and I are similarly wired? Because I think, and I hope it's okay for me to say this, and maybe I'm making an assumption. I think our childhood experiences are dramatically different.
Hmm.
Yet we've come out of those with similar things. So is it human experience? Is it intergenerational transmission of trauma? What is it? But it's interesting to me. And again, this is my perspective, and not everybody is going to agree with this perspective. My life experience has been that intimate relationship is the hardest thing ever. Like, it's the hardest thing. And I believe that part of the reason it's hard is when it's complex, because you're talking about your story, right? You made up this story about this friend, right? I made up these stories about my partner. And you have to remember the other person's also making up stories. And so it gets really complicated. And so if you have two people in a relationship and they've done no work, and they have no conscious awareness of this, they're going to just be battling with each other and bouncing off each other and reacting to each other and acting out and having no idea that they are. And I think this is why you see so many relationships, whether it's familiar, whether it's friends, whether it's collegial, whether it's intimate, where there are problems or they fall apart or they become estranged because it's so complicated at times. And there's emotion, like you were saying that sometimes the emotion feels so big. And I mean, believe me, I can relate to that. There are times, there's a reason they call it flooding. In my world, in the therapy world, there is a term called emotional flooding. And usually it happens with trauma. But, we talk about big T trauma, which is threats to our life, or little T traumas, which are threats to our sense of well-being or emotional well-being. And the same thing happens. It's part of the trauma response is the flooding. You get flooded with emotion. And the purpose of that is to create some form of survival pattern, which is you run like hell, you fight, or you play dead, or you try to appease and talk somebody out of something. And when you talked about your situation, when you said, well, fuck you's a fight, actually, or
Mm.
it could be a flight, right?
Mhm.
Depending on whether you engage the person in the fuck you, or if you're like, fuck you, I'm out of here, that's flight. But that's just that is the normal human response to threat.
Mm. And so it's not like you need to have all this really like complex trauma in your background to be experiencing this. And I'm sure that that only makes it that much more intense for you, but you don't need to necessarily have all these really horrible experiences that you can point to explain like, oh, this is the reason why I'm coming up with these stories in my head. It's almost like what I'm hearing you say is that everyone is doing this at the same time.
Yes. It's just the question is to what degree. So my feeling is that's just part of being human. The moment we wake up, the moment we have consciousness, we're making up stories all throughout the day. Now, sometimes the stories are positive stories.
Yeah. Like, let's talk about so
Stories
like
are
what
not
are
bad.
yeah, like what are some stories like if you, that you've heard a lot, whether it's like ones that you've told yourself or like ones that you've heard from like clients, like what are like other themes of stories like or like what is like you can start to like listen maybe for like let me say this another way. For people listening right now that are maybe like, okay, I don't know if I'm telling myself stories, what those stories are, like these doesn't really apply to me. Like, could you maybe like talk about like ways that you can pinpoint that you're in a story, like whether that's like certain language, like what those often will sound like from your experience as a therapist or kind of navigating your own stories?
Absolutely. Well, and first, I mean, what I want to say first and foremost is we are always telling ourselves stories. We're not ever out of a story. Now, some stories, especially those based on trauma, will often take us far out of the present moment. The moment we start a story, okay, we're actually taking ourselves out of what's actually happening. And when I talk about what's actually happening, these are things that we sense. We either see it, smell it, hear it, feel it. It's right there. It's objective. And I want to make a distinction between real and fact because our experiences are real. They feel very real. So I want to make a distinction. We're talking about factual information, data points that we take in through our senses before we interpret the information, right? And so we're always telling ourselves stories. When we're in a story, it actually takes us from the actual factual information. I can actually literally feel me leaving the situation. Like I
Mhm.
am no longer present and experiencing what's happening in front of me. I'm already in a story that takes me away from the moment. It's almost like daydreaming. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. We've all daydreamed, right? All of us have been in a classroom and we are like off somewhere else, right? We're thinking about, being at the beach or we're thinking about the date we're going to have that night or something. We're physically in a situation, right? We're sitting on a chair. We're kind of hearing the professor lecture or whatever, but our mind, we're gone. We're enjoying something else. And in some ways, that's how we can tell that we're not present. We are somewhere else. Your body is physically there, but you're gone. Like you're off. Like you can, with my self-awareness, I've actually really paid attention and I felt myself, like my mind leave. And it's almost like I lose contact. Like all of a sudden, sometimes I'm not even hearing clearly, or I'm not even, it's almost like I'm not even seeing. Like, it's almost like I think about things that have been activated in my relationship. It's almost like my partner disappears, and my partner didn't disappear. It's like I'm gone. And so I lose that touch with reality. And when I talk about the touch with reality, it's literally through our senses. All of a sudden, I'm not seeing it. All of a sudden, I'm not hearing it. All of a sudden, I'm not feeling it. And I'm somewhere else. And I think that's the best way to describe it. Now, the degree to which this happens, I think it has a lot to do with how much trauma you've experienced. So for myself, I've experienced a lot of trauma. So I will go far away from, or I have. I don't think this happens for me as much now with the work that I've done, but in the beginning, I would be gone. Like I would be gone into this, like I walked out of this world into this other world, in this script, in this story, in this storyline, and it removed me from the present moment. And that's usually how you can tell. And there can be degrees of that. There can actually be degrees of it where if you really pay attention, you'll notice, oh, wow, I stopped hearing my partner speak.
Mm.
Or, oh, wow, I just realized that my partner isn't even in my vision, like in my line of vision. Or, gosh, I feel like I'm like floating away or something. I mean, those are really good signs to know that you are actually in the middle of your story.
What is it about trauma that makes people go deeper into the story when you are a survivor of trauma, whether that be, sexual violence or abandonment and neglect or, a lot of anger or violence, whatever it may be, so many of us have experienced these traumas in our lives. Like, what is it about that shapes the depth we go into our stories or the kind of stories that we're telling ourselves that pull us out of reality?
Hmm. That's a great question. And again, this is my perspective, and there may be others that have
Yeah.
a different perspective than I
I'm
do.
I'm I'm also curious of, like, yourself as a person and as a psychologist, like, it's both of those things at
Right.
once. Yeah.
I'll do both. I think that's a great. I mean, sometimes
Yeah.
it's hard to separate that, right? I am
Of
I'm I
course,
am me,
yeah.
and I'm also a psychologist, but sometimes those are pretty interwoven. So here's the cool thing: there's a reason why we do what we do. I mean, I am just fascinated. I've been always fascinated with the human psyche. I mean, as far as I can remember, 4 years old, just being fascinated. And we are designed in such a way to survive. That is what we're designed for. And when we have traumas, and so for people who have big T traumas, and especially so I have a specific kind of trauma because there's different kinds of traumas. I have what is called complex trauma. It's also been referred to as developmental trauma. And basically what that means is as I was growing up, as my brain is developing, I am being exposed to lower level traumas chronically. And so my brain structure, my neural pathways have formed around my exposures to trauma. So what really differentiates your average person who doesn't have trauma going into stories and the depth to which they go into these stories, and somebody who's like myself who's experienced complex trauma and we go deeper into it, it's almost like we have these very strong neural pathways. They're stronger,
Mm.
and we're designed to survive what's ever happening. And so when you talk to people who've experienced lots of trauma, one of the things that they will often talk about, so for example, a person who's experienced incest, for example, they have left their body. And they will even talk about experiences. Some people will talk about experiences like I was floating. I was floating and I could see my body. I could see what was happening to me. That's really severe trauma. And what happens is when we have those neural pathways and we just have the default pattern of these survival patterns, it's going to pull us deeper into the experience because our threat to our safety is so deep. Where somebody who doesn't have that, they don't have those deep threats to their safety. They're not going to go as deep into that experience.
It's interesting to hear you, talk about that because I feel like trauma has become such it's becoming more mainstream of a concept. Like, I feel like more people are talking about trauma and all the ways that it appears, whether it's trauma in your family or from your caretakers or from a partner, or maybe it's trauma from a system or living in a nation, or systemic traumas. Like there's so many different forms of trauma. And I think for me, at least, I sometimes struggle to understand what trauma is doing in the body and how I feel trauma every day. So I feel like everyone has experienced some form of trauma, and it can be a wide range of trauma. But I think it's interesting to talk about it at the level of like neural pathways, and this very kind of scientific and very like biological thing, and that is what's shaping it, and it makes me feel a little bit better that, I'm not necessarily crazy for,
Right.
feeling these things. And um I'm thinking a lot about too, maybe just like the intergenerational element of it too. I mean, you weren't neglectful or abusive to me as a child the way that you experienced, but I can imagine that a lot of the ways that you navigate the world, the ways that you raised me are still informed by that trauma that you experienced. And maybe some of that shaped the way that I experienced the world too in some ways.
Hmm.
And so I think that's all to say. It's like this really messy, thorny topic, and sometimes it's really easy for me to invalidate my feelings because of that. Like it's like, okay, this person just didn't just text me back, or just this person. Let's go back. My friend just didn't text me back, and it somehow feels like I'm losing everything. It feels like I'm worthless. It feels like I'm not important or like I'm not safe.
Hmm.
And so I think when that happens, it's very easy for me to be like, "Oh, you're crazy as someone for feeling that way." And it's nice to know there's some element that's just like out of my control that I'm living in this story right now.
Exactly, exactly. And there's nothing wrong with you, and I think that's what happens. And I know that when I look at my own story, Esteban, and my own healing experience, and, I think this is part of the thing. I shouldn't say this is part. I would say this is the number one reason that my message is what it is. And that is owning your story. It was because I needed to own my own story. And what I mean by that is for a very long time, I really did believe that there was something wrong with me. Like, because I was having these responses and these reactions and I was struggling, I really thought that there was something wrong. And what I realized over time is not only through my expertise as a psychologist, but my own healing process, it's like, this isn't my fault. This is biologically wired in me. It's just having the consciousness to know what to do with it so that you don't get stuck in those patterns. And, we think about this idea of nature versus nurture, right? And inheritance. And one of the things I think it's cool. Again, I'm going to kind of geek out with my scientist brain, right? Um, I think what's interesting is for you and I to have these conversations, because you did have a different upbringing than I did, but yet you and I have some similar patterns or patterning. And it's like, well, why is that in our DNA and it was inevitable you were going to be born this way? Or is it something that you picked up because, we could have a whole nother episode about connection and how we're connected to people, and how when we're in close proximity, our nervous systems actually co-regulate. And it's possible that you picked up on things from me that were never spoken. Like, one of the things that I wonder about, when you've talked about, like, for example, your own body and feeling tight and rigid and stuff, right? I had a realization only 4 years ago. 4 years ago. And I remember, I'll never forget it. I was standing in my bedroom and I was like, oh my God, my body, like I was bracing. Like, I recognized I was literally bracing. Like, I could feel the tightness in my muscles. And I'm like, why am I bracing? I am
Mm,
perfectly safe. I have spent, let's see, 30 years of never being unsafe. Nobody's hit me. Nobody's beat me. I've never felt it. And yet I'm bracing, like I'm waiting for a blow. And it was like, it was one of the biggest ahas in my moment in my life, where it was like, oh my God, my body is actually stuck in a pattern of survival. And it was unnecessary because my current circumstances didn't call for it.
mm,
And that was it was very powerful. And so what I wonder about is there a possibility that you, being my child and being around me and sensing me, like, oh my God, mom's bracing. Maybe I need to brace. What am I waiting for? Because
Mhm.
we're connected.
Mhm.
Or is it in your DNA? Because I have no idea what my parents experienced. That generation didn't talk about things. They didn't talk to me about things. So I have no idea what it was like for my father to be in his body or my
Mm.
mother to be in her body, and whether my dad was bracing all the time or not. I don't know. But I think it's fascinating for you and I to have the conversation.
You've been with your partner for almost all of my life, and the two of you have been, you know, that like defining parental relationship I've had throughout my life. And, you know, I feel like throughout all the trouble that you had, I mean, I was also experiencing a lot of those things. Like this was like my, um, you know, caretaker and her partner, experiencing trouble, and this was, it was hard to see like my mom upset about these things. There's probably a variety of factors of why this has been passed down, but there's also experiences that I've had, I think, just growing up in the shadow of someone like you telling your story to yourself and living in this kind of trance state, that's not quite trauma, and I want to be very clear that those are very different things, but I think it has very similar effects to trauma and maybe can be pointed to as like maybe a little T trauma or like a complex trauma, like you said, of just, constantly being around this person that is hurt, and telling themselves this story, and it's not to blame you or anything or to make you feel bad. I think as I've gotten older, I've especially been more aware of the like, oh, like my parents were just human, my parents were just like also young. And I think I had a lot of maybe challenges with that growing up, because I expected my parents to be like super people, and to be, flawless and, iron tight. And I feel like in a lot of ways you were that person, you stopped a lot of the cycles of trauma in your life, and you built this life for yourself, and you decided you weren't going to raise your child in this world that you were raised in. And so I'm very appreciative of all those things, and at the same time, it's like, it's hard to kind of come out from under this kind of storytelling and trance state. And I think at this point closer to 34 than I am obviously a newborn child. And so I think I can start to conceptualize what it's like to be that age and like, oh my God, like I also don't have my shit together. And I also, am like living in trauma states a lot of the time, or living in these trance states a lot of the time. And yeah, so
Yeah.
I think it's like this journey of having to like almost not quite forgive, but like understand you a little bit more and understand you as a full person, which it sounds like it's something you also had to do with your partner and yourself and everyone around you.
Right. It's interesting you bring some of this stuff up. There's several things that are going on for me. One is there is such thing as secondary trauma.
Mhm.
And secondary trauma is when you're experiencing trauma because somebody else is experiencing trauma. So if you think about that, you can actually extrapolate or generalize from that and go, okay, if my loved one is in a trauma state or a trance, I'm observing that and it's impacting me, and it's going to be
Mhm.
my some form of trauma for me. There's that part of it that has really struck me. I think the other thing that really strikes me or has got me curious is, okay, you think about the three of us, right? I was telling myself stories, right? Okay, she's telling herself stories, and then you're telling yourself stories about what you're observing between the two of us. Like, I'm now learning that I tried really hard and very consciously to shelter you from my trauma. Like I felt like I was trying to do it behind closed doors, or because I didn't want to pull you into that. And yet, us talking about it as adults, I was naive. I thought I could, and I didn't.
Mhm.
I want to make it clear to the listeners, Sky and I were not duking it out in front of you, and we weren't, just vomiting all of our shit in front of you. There were times that it was behind closed doors, but it doesn't matter because you and I were connected, and I'm sure you could feel it. You could feel when I was off. You could feel when I was sad. You could feel when I was in my trauma. And so just feeling it, you had to make sense of it. Like,
Mhm.
I wonder, and the fact that I am your parent, and Sky came along later. sometimes I wonder if you were really protective of me. Like
Of
Sky was the
course.
bad guy, I was the victim and Sky
Yeah.
was the bad guy. That was a story you made up, right?
Of course. I mean, it's a very simple story, I think, especially for someone that was a child when was experiencing that. But that's definitely the story that I experienced for most of my life, I think, was that, just because of the nature of your relationship, your partner has never really quite been my second parent. They've been a caretaker and a part of my life. But I think I unequivocally saw you as like my mom and my parent and my only mom and parent, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, our family's a little more complex. I have multiple caretakers, but I saw you as like this is my mom and my person. And I think no matter how much you try to hide what's happening or the struggles that you're having, I think, kids are just so observant and they notice things. And whether it's noticing a fight, or noticing, just that like my mom's mood is really down today. My mom seems really quiet today. And I want her to be more happy. And like, why isn't she happy? Oh, it's because she's fighting with this person who's not my parent, and I think
Mm-hmm.
for most of my childhood and even in like to being a teenager and as a young adult, I think I held on to a lot of those stories too. And I think that could be a whole other episode of, or a whole other conversation of just like those stories. I mean, I think that those kinds of stories have been like probably the defining stories I've like lived with for most of my life, of just like
Mm-hmm.
the things I learned and the things I told myself and the stories I had from watching your relationship, I think, and the way that it impacted me. And it's been hard sometimes. Like, I think it's been hard to parse through those things, like, see how the way I show up for my partner probably reflects a lot of those, like, lessons I had, and, like, the way I show up for my friends probably reflect a lot of those lessons that I had, and, I think in the same way that I had to, like, see you as human and see you as, like, someone that's not a bad person or a bad parent, I think you're the opposite of those things. I think I also had to do that for, Sky, your partner, I think, in a lot of ways, and that was a lot harder, that was having to, like, kind of turn my whole world upside down in some ways of, like, okay, maybe she's not a horrible person, maybe she's not a villain of this story, and, I remember I remember when I was a kid, I'm very fortunate, I think, just being raised by a psychologist that I was able to do things like go to therapy as a child, which is an experience not a lot of children have, obviously, and I was seeing my therapist, and she had said, uh, Sky, your partner said, Sky is not that powerful. You're giving her way too much power. She's not that conniving. She's not that strong. She's not that like brilliant. Like the power you're giving her that as being the bad guy is like assuming that she is like the ultimate vindictive dictator of the entire world. And like you just know she's not that person. She can be a lot of other things, but that's not the case. And I think it took me until maybe the last couple of years to like actually digest that, actually believe
Mm-hmm.
that. And we all have our issues with each other. We all have our fights and qualms, and that doesn't change. But also, I'm curious about like, when you're in that story, if you've been able to identify, like maybe I'm telling myself things that are either not true or not the full truth, or don't, capture everything that's happening at once. Like, what are the steps you can take to maybe get closer to something? I struggle with the term that's like true or reality because I think that both of those things are never neutral. So maybe like neutral is a better word, and that's like a little bit less charged.
Or how
But
about
I
just
don't. Yeah,
how
fact.
about
Well,
just facts?
yeah, because well, and
Yeah,
even and I want you to talk a little bit about that too, like the journey from story to fact and what it
right.
looks like to get to truth. Because I think so often truth is just another story. Like the truth I could have been telling myself was that your partner is bad, my mom is great. That's the truth.
Mhm,
My mom's partner
mhm,
causes all the fights. Like that's the truth I'm living in. So I'm
mhm.
curious, like how you can kind of parse that out and like how you can get to something a little bit more neutral and why it's important to do that.
Right, right. It's interesting that we're having this conversation because I will tell you, this is probably the most common or most often conversation that I have with clients. And that is, first of all, first and foremost, separating, we have our truth, my truth, your truth. But there really isn't the truth. There is no such thing, just like there's no such thing as reality. There is my reality, your reality, but there is such thing as fact. And quite frankly, when you look at an experience, when you actually look at an experience, there's probably very little that is factual in an
Mm,
experience. Like I'll use an example. of a client that I have, and I tell you, almost every session, I'm like, "Are you telling yourself a story right now? What story are you telling yourself? Okay, wait a minute, slow down. You just went off with a story." That is something I often say with clients, and then I'll back them up and I'll say, what do you know for sure? What is the fact in this information? Okay. So it could be something very simple. Like, for example, something simple. She didn't text me back. That is a fact. And how do you tell something is a fact? It's observable. Everybody's going to agree that it happened. Sometimes we can think about, like, if we were watching a movie and there was no sound, what we see, there's a
Mhm.
house there, there's a car there, the sky is blue, there's clouds in the sky. Everybody would agree that what they're observing, there's an agreement that that thing is happening. It's a very small part of what we tell ourselves. And so you want to get to the fact. So let's sort, for example, I think, Esteban, you were saying about your experience with your friend, that, yeah, I don't know if it was you weren't hearing from him, or let's say you weren't hearing from him. Let's say you hadn't had any communication, right?
Mhm.
So the fact is, my friend John, hasn't texted me in 5 days. That's a fact. It's observable and measurable,
Mhm.
but that's it. Now, what you're telling yourself about that is totally fictional. It's not true. You could say he doesn't care about me, or he likes his other friends better, or, he doesn't care if I'm okay or not. I mean, those are all stories. The only piece of data in there that is factual is the fact that he hasn't texted you in 5 days. That's it. That's simple.
The fact is like a lot it feels like the fact is a lot more, like you said, simpler, like smaller. Like, and there's like oftentimes like maybe just like it's gonna be like boiled down to like one sentence almost, it sounds like.
Maybe even less.
Maybe even less.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even less. Yeah, it
So
could be one data point.
so how do you like put away the shit to get to that one data point? Because I feel like for me, like as you're talking about, like let's talk about my friend for example, like I can already think about like, okay, I'm trying to get to that fact, and I think all of the things I would say immediately also feel like just another story. Like for example, I could say like, oh, they haven't texted me back, or they're ignoring me, or they don't like me, or they forgot about me, or something like that. Like those all feel like those can almost be a fact. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious, like, is there like a test or like a simple way that you can like start to think like, okay, maybe that's not quite there yet to the fact. I'm still in the
Yeah.
story.
Oh, I think it's a great question. I think first and foremost, one of the things that I think is really important to recognize is you can't stop yourself from telling yourself stories. The moment, I mean, our brains, what our brains do, it's like our lungs. Our lungs fill with air, it helps us breathe. Our stomach digests foods. Well, our mind creates stories. It creates meaning. That's what it does. You can't stop it. And don't judge yourself for having stories. So that's not the point. What you want to do is to be able to soften the grip of the story.
Hmm.
When we buy into the story and we believe it is the truth and it's real, and then we make all these decisions about what we're going to do next because we believe this, what we need to do is loosen the grip. So how can you loosen the grip? Let's use your example, Esteban. Let's say your friend hasn't texted you for several days. Okay, that's the fact. Now you've made up stories. He's ignoring me. He might be mad at me. He doesn't care about me. He likes this other person better. I bet he's spending a lot of time with this other person. Those are all stories. Okay. You can't stop your mind from making up the stories. But what you can do is you can go, wait a minute. What are the stories I'm telling myself? List them, list all the stories. Okay. What do I know is a fact in this story? I know the fact is he hasn't texted me for 5 days. So what you can do is soften by, okay, what could be all of the reasons why he hasn't texted me in 5 days? All of them. Come up with, you could brainstorm. You could come up with 15 different reasons.
He got in a car
Now,
crash. He lost his
say that
phone.
again.
He like dropped it in a bucket of water or something.
Yeah, he's in the hospital,
Yeah.
somebody's abducted him. I mean, you can be funny about it, but
I
the
I just
point
jump in
is,
really I just jump in really quickly here, but I had this like one friend who was like really interested in this guy, and the guy ghosted him for like he just like stopped texting him back. And then we all went out to dinner, my boyfriend and I and this guy, and like literally like last week, and he's like, you'll never guess what. He texted me back 11 months later. And he basically was like, sorry, like I went to Mexico and had my phone stolen, and I'm just not getting my contacts back. But I really liked hanging out with you. Let's hang out again.
oh my God.
So like, that's a perfect example. Like the guy was, and our friend was like, "Should I believe this?" I was like, honestly, if he reached out to you 11 months later, I feel like he must be interested in you. Like, that feels real to me.
That is funny.
Yeah,
But
but
that's a
keep
great
going, yeah.
example,
Yeah.
Esteban. I mean, that's a great example because what it will do, because again, this is a whole nother episode, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with this. You know, I've talked about the ego and what the ego does. And one of the things it does is it makes up stories and it holds onto the stories like a death grip. Like your very survival is dependent on this story. So it gets really tight and rigid around it. So when we challenge ourselves and go, I'm going to come up with 15 things that could possibly explain why he hasn't texted me, and they could be silly. He's been abducted or, whatever. What happens is it softens everything. It softens it. So the story doesn't have a grip to it anymore. And so then you can laugh about it and you can go, okay, all of these could be possible. One of these could be possible. None of them can be possible. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick with the facts, man, and just go, all I know is he hasn't texted me for 5 days. And what do I want to do with that? That's how you can kind of get out of the stories.
Hmm. And I know this is going to be, a conversation for the next couple weeks. So if you're really enjoying this conversation, I encourage you to subscribe, follow along, because we're going to be going through each of these lessons for the next 12 weeks about how you can not only tell facts from stories, but go all the way to stopping the story that's happening, owning the story that's going on, and then rewriting the story altogether to live the life that you want. So I want to give a little bit of a preview of what's to come. And I want you to talk a little bit about what can happen next after you are able to stop that story. Like, what possibilities emerge when you're able to remove yourself from that trance state, from that story state, and you're like, okay, now what? Like, what can happen from there? Like, what are some of the possibilities to be able to give you the life or give you the experience that you'd rather be having?
That's a great question. And we can go into more depth with this the next time that we meet. I think what's really important about this is to recognize we're always telling ourselves stories. And, they can be in the moment stories and they can be bigger stories, and we can look at all of those stories that we tell ourselves. And I think what's important is to recognize that's what we do. We tell stories. And then our point of power or our sense of agency comes from, I could make up any story that I want to make up. And what does it do for me? Because, I think what's interesting is probably 90%, maybe even 95, maybe even higher than 95% of what we're telling ourselves, they're just stories. And we have a tendency to tell ourselves stories that make us feel really bad.
Hmm.
And yet they're not true. Why not tell ourselves different stories that uplift us, that empower us, that make us feel good, that make us feel expansive? If a story's a story, why not tell ourselves different stories? That are healthy, that are good for us, that inspire us, inspire us to do great things, rather than stories that make us feel small and make us shrink and make us feel bad and ashamed of ourselves.
And it also, I mean, I love all that. I feel like that's really exciting. I feel like something that I need, and I can imagine a lot of people need right now. I feel like what I'm hearing throughout all this work is it's not just about, you know, feeling better in your body or feeling better, in your mind, which is a huge part of this work too. But what I've seen you do, because you've done so much over your 35 plus year career. Is that how long you've been working?
Yeah, about just a little under 35, just a little.
Yeah, and so I feel like throughout all that, you've done so many things, and I think like one thing that I see you do again and again is you really help people build more fulfilling relationships, and it's not just about this individual enterprise. It's relationships, yes, to yourself, and the way you experience yourself in your world, but it's relationships to your loved ones and your partners and your coworkers and your community. And I think if you were to go out even larger than that, there's relationships to people that are in your community, out of your community, your neighbors, like people all around you. Like what this framework you're talking about could maybe offer folks is the ability to stop the stories that are getting in the way of those relationships to maybe build more healthy relationships within the romantic world, familiar world. Like, you know, this might be a stretch, but also like within like politics, like our community,
Mhm.
like this could potentially be something that has such a wide range of applications.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, um, you know, one of the most helpful things that ever happened for me in the political arena is when I had a very, very dear friend of mine. I mean, I just adored her. I had an opposing political view that I had. And because I loved her dearly, I was willing to put down my
Mm,
stories about the political opposition. And it was a gift for me because that was really important, to recognize, oh, you know, what I might be telling myself about people who have opposing political kind of perspectives than I do, that I could be making up stories about who they are, and they can be untrue. And, for us to really consider that, like, I think what's really important also, Esteban, at the end of the day, is that our stories do matter because they impact what decisions we make and how we show up. And as you and I are having this conversation, there's a part of me that's anticipating um, listeners with this pushback and almost a ridicule of, oh yeah, let's just make up some stories and life is going to be great. We're going to be, rainbows and sunshine. All we have to do is change our stories. That's not what I'm saying at all. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying make shit up. What I'm saying is understand the way that we're wired as humans, and that what we have a tendency to do is to create meaning out of things, and meaning isn't always the fact. It's a meaning that we place that creates our whole experience. And if it's not even true, if it's not even factually true, why do we hold on to those stories, particularly when they create suffering and pain for us, and sometimes suffering and pain for people who are in our realm of connection? So it's our responsibility to have that consciousness. So at the end of the day, it's not just about the stories that we tell ourselves, because it's also the stories that we tell ourselves about other people. It means something. It makes a difference, because the story we tell about our neighbor that we never talk to, or the person at the grocery store, or again, somebody who has an imposing political view to you, that the story we tell ourselves makes a difference, because what we're going to do is it's going to impact how we interact with that person, whether we're kind or not kind. And then whatever we do with that other person, it has an impact. And then that person takes it to the next person. And so I think it's really important to understand that the stories we tell ourselves are meaningful and impactful, and they make a difference, not just in our lives, but in any other person's life that we come in contact with. And so there's a responsibility in this. There's a responsibility in having a conscious awareness of, what are you telling yourself? What am I telling myself? Not only about myself, and am I uplifting myself? Am I inspiring myself? Am I encouraging myself? Am I loving and being kind and compassionate to myself? But is the story that I'm creating about my neighbor, or the person down the street, or the person at the grocery store, am I doing the same thing? Am I telling stories that diminish them and make them the villain of my story? Or am I telling myself a story that shows compassion and kindness and connection with that person? And I think that's really important.
mm. I mean, I completely agree, and I'm really excited to just jump more into this. I feel like this is like a healing balm that I need for myself, and I feel like everyone needs. And it happens on so many levels, and I think these are things I need for my relationships, and these are things I definitely need for just our current moment, where I think we all just feel so at odds with one another, and feel like it's unfathomable to consider each other's humanity. I'm taking away from this conversation, I think, just the way that feelings and stories circulate among us all, the way they're like distributed among us all. They're not just these things that live inside of us, they're things that really impact the way we show up in the world, the way that we interact with each other. And those are just kind of stories, kind of being bounced all around. And it reminds me to how we started this conversation talking about your relationship with your partner. There was a lot of stories that you were living in that shaped the way you showed up in that relationship, and the way that she showed up, and same for her. It was all of her stories. And it was those stories interacting with each other that is what caused all this friction, at the beginning and throughout your relationship. And it sounds like it was discovering that maybe these stories are not fact. That was what helped you turn the page in your relationship and build something new for each other.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I love it. I love it. And I'm excited to start this like 90-day journey with you. I'm gonna be following along too. Whether it's me here, chatting it up with you or like reading it on the blog too. I know I need these things. So yeah. And so if you're looking to join this journey, you can follow us, you can subscribe at the link in bio. We're gonna be posting a podcast like this one here, as well as a written guide, some practices that you can download, some guides on social media. So if you're interested in rewriting the story that you're living in, feel free to follow us along there to follow along on this journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you.